late February of 1968. The freezing gray waters off the Kamchatka Peninsula, the Soviet Pacific Fleet submarine designated K-129 slips its moorings, navigates past the breakwater, and glides into the unforgiving expanse of the North Pacific. This vessel is not one of the fast, sleek, newly minted nuclear attack boats beginning to dominate the oceans. This is a Project 629, a Gulf II class submarine. It is a heavy, lumbering, diesel-electric vessel. It is an older design, requiring it to periodically run close to the surface, raising its snorkel mast to pull in oxygen, and run its massive diesel engines to recharge its enormous banks of lead-acid batteries. But what the Gulf II class lacks in prolonged submerged endurance, it compensates for with immense strategic firepower. Housed within the elongated, widened sail of the submarine are 3 vertical launch tubes. Inside each of these heavy steel cylinders sits an SSN-4 SARC nuclear ballistic missile. Each weapon is armed with a 1 megaton warhead, carrying enough destructive yield to obliterate a major coastal city or a massive naval installation. Furthermore, these are liquid-fueled missiles. They require highly volatile, highly corrosive propellants to function, adding a profound layer of mechanical risk to every single day the boat spends at sea. The stakes of this patrol are absolute. The crew of 98 officers and enlisted men, operating under the experienced command of Captain First Rank Vladimir Kobzar, know their boat intimately. They have drilled for this precise mission profile for months. Their assigned patrol grid stretches thousands of miles eastward, pushing toward the deep waters northwest of the Hawaiian Islands. Their job is to remain a silent, undetected launch platform, a vital arm of the Soviet nuclear deterrent waiting in the deep, should the geopolitical standoff of the era suddenly ignite into open conflict. Look at what the declassified records show about the sheer scale of operations required, just to maintain this underwater standoff. If you want to understand the real engineering mechanics and the immense strategic gambles of these Cold War operations, subscribe to continue uncovering classified archives with us. There is so much more beneath the surface of the official historical narrative. Fast forward to the second week of March. Submarine operations rely on strict, uncompromising communication protocols. To remain undetected, a ballistic missile submarine does not maintain continuous radio contact. Instead, it relies on scheduled burst transmissions. At a highly specific, prearranged time, the submarine raises a radio antenna just above the surface of the ocean and fires a compressed, highly encrypted signal back to the naval headquarters in Vladivostok. It is a simple digital handshake, confirming the boat is operational, the crew is secure, and the vessel remains on station. The scheduled window for K-129 arrives. Hundreds of miles away in the communication bunkers of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, the radio operators wait on the designated high-frequency channel. Nothing comes through, just the static of atmospheric noise. At first, there is no immediate panic. Radio anomalies are a standard hazard of naval operations. Severe weather patterns, atmospheric interference, or a simple mechanical fault in a radio mast can easily cause a missed check-in. Standard protocol dictates that the command structure simply wait for the next scheduled broadcast window. The hours tick by. The secondary window opens. Again, absolute silence. Think about what that decision actually meant for the Soviet Admiralty. A massive steel cylinder packed with high explosives, an entire grid of hydrogen battery cells, and 3 live nuclear weapons has simply ceased to exist on the command board. It is a severe logistical problem to lose a surface ship. It is an entirely different operational nightmare to lose a mobile nuclear launch platform without a single distress call. The realization slowly creeps through the highest echelons of the Soviet military command. K-129 is not experiencing a routine communication blackout. It is gone. The response from the Soviet Pacific Fleet is unprecedented in its scale and suddenness. It is a massive deployment that immediately shatters the usual calculated rhythms of Cold War naval posturing. Within days, the Soviet Navy throws everything it has into the North Pacific. Dozens of surface vessels, including heavily armed destroyers, frigates, fleet oilers, and specialized submarine rescue ships, steam out of their bases at maximum speed. Overhead, the sky is filled with the deep, throbbing drone of Tupolev Tu-95 bear bombers. These massive, 4-engine, long-range maritime patrol aircraft fly grueling grid patterns over the vast, gray swells of the ocean. The flight crews push their endurance to the absolute limit. They drop sonar buoys into the freezing water. They run visual sweeps, staring out of blister windows for hours. scanning the turbulent surface for oil slicks, debris fields, or the faint signal of an emergency distress beacon. The search area they must cover is staggering. The North Pacific in March is not a forgiving environment. It is characterized by brutal weather systems, massive cresting swells, and an ocean floor that plunges rapidly into deep, lightless trenches. The Soviet fleet commanders are operating largely blind. They rely entirely on the estimated patrol route of Captain Kobzar. They follow the navigational lines drawn on their charts, working under the assumption that the submarine suffered a fatal mechanical casualty somewhere along its intended track, and that the crew might be drifting on the surface or trapped in a shallow enough depth to allow a rescue. Day after day, the surface ships drag acoustic arrays through the water. The aircraft burn thousands of gallons of aviation fuel, sweeping the empty horizon. They find nothing. Not a single piece of floating cork insulation. Not a trace of diesel fuel. Not a single acoustic ping from a survival radio. Just miles of empty ocean. But that massive Soviet mobilization is only the surface of the story. While the Soviet Admiralty wrestles with a growing sense of failure, another group of people is watching this frantic, desperate activity unfold in real time. American naval intelligence. The United States military constantly monitors the movement of Soviet strategic assets. When dozens of ships and long-range bombers suddenly sprint into the open ocean, alarm bells ring loudly in Washington. Initially, American commanders might wonder if this sudden surge is a massive, unannounced naval exercise, or, more concerningly, a prelude to a rapid, aggressive military escalation. However, the operational pattern of the Soviet ships tells a very different story. They are not maneuvering in tactical attack formations. They are not practicing fleet defense. They are sailing in strict, tight search grids. They are moving methodically, covering the same patches of rough water repeatedly. Furthermore, the intercepted radio traffic between the ships and the mainland, even when heavily encrypted, carries the frantic, dense volume of an emergency response. Intelligence analysts look at the tracking data. They plot the coordinates of the Soviet aircraft. It does not take long for the American military apparatus to piece together the reality of the situation. The Soviet Navy has lost a submarine, and based on the sheer quantity of assets deployed to find it, it is a submarine of immense strategic value. For weeks, the Americans watch the search continue. The Soviets are looking at hundreds of thousands of square miles of ocean surface, hoping against hope for a physical clue. But the Americans have a strategic advantage the Soviets do not fully comprehend. The United States military does not need to search the surface of the water. They have been quietly listening to the deep. Eventually, the massive Soviet search winds down. The harsh reality sets in. The surface ships run low on supplies and return to port. The bombers are grounded. The Soviet Navy officially writes off the Golf II submarine, concluding it was lost at sea with all hands in an unknown location. They abandon the search, leaving their lost crew and their nuclear payload to the abyss. But the submarine is not lost to everyone. While the creators of K-129 accepted their blind defeat, the Americans are quietly sitting on a monumental intelligence victory. They know exactly what happened. They know exactly when it happened. And most importantly, they know the precise coordinates where thousands of tons of mangled Soviet steel rest on the ocean floor, 3 miles deep. How did the United States military, watching the frantic Soviet maneuvers from afar, manage to pinpoint the exact location of a highly classified wreck that its own creators could not find? The ocean is not silent. It is a dense, highly conductive medium for acoustic energy. Deep underwater, beneath the churning surface waves and the shifting thermal layers, there exists a unique physical phenomenon known as the deep sound channel. Due to a highly specific combination of water temperature, pressure, and salinity, sound waves trapped in this horizontal layer can travel for thousands of miles across the globe with almost zero loss of energy. The United States Navy thoroughly understood the immense strategic value of this underwater acoustic highway. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, they poured massive resources into building the sound surveillance system. This was a highly classified network consisting of hundreds of miles of armored hydrophone cables laid directly onto the continental shelves of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. These massive arrays of underwater microphones were designed with one singular purpose. They were built to listen to the deep, constantly tracking the faint mechanical humming of distant submarines. While the Soviet surface fleet was blindly dragging acoustic arrays through the rough waters of the North Pacific, military analysts at naval intelligence facilities in the United States were quietly spooling through miles of paper trace recordings generated by these hydrophones. They were looking backwards in time. They combed through the raw acoustic data captured during the early days of March, searching for any sudden violent anomaly that stood out from the ambient background noise of biological life and commercial shipping. They found something massive. A low-frequency, incredibly powerful acoustic event recorded exactly on the 11th of March. When a massive steel pressure hull collapses under the crushing weight of the ocean, it does not simply crumple quietly. The ambient water pressure forces its way into the sealed volume of the submarine in a fraction of a second, causing the surrounding water to slam together with the kinetic force of a high explosive. It unleashes a violent supersonic shockwave that rings through the deep sound channel like a bell. The hydrophone network heard this catastrophic implosion, but a single hydrophone array cannot pinpoint a location. It only provides a directional bearing, a long line drawn across a map. To find a single object in the vastness of the Pacific, you need intersecting lines. Stay with me here, because this is where the interagency intelligence tradecraft reaches an entirely new level of sophistication. The naval acoustic data was simply not enough on its own. They needed another ear. They turned to the United States Air Force. The Air Force operated its own highly classified global network, not of hydrophones, but of deep Earth seismic monitors. Their primary mission was to detect illegal atmospheric or underground nuclear detonations by reading the faint, percussive shock waves propagating through the crust of the Earth. When intelligence analysts cross-referenced the Navy hydrophone tapes with the Air Force seismic readouts from the 11th of March, the acoustic shadows suddenly aligned. The synchronized data revealed two distinct, catastrophic implosion events occurring mere minutes apart. By mathematically measuring the microscopic differences in the time it took the sound waves to reach different listening stations scattered across the Pacific Rim, acoustic engineers could draw multiple intersecting lines of bearing. Where those lines crossed, they painted a highly precise target box on the map. The coordinates pointed to a grid roughly 1,500 miles northwest of the island of Oahu. But knowing a mathematical grid coordinate is entirely different from actually seeing what lies at the bottom of the ocean. The sea floor at this specific geographic location plunges to a crushing depth of 16,400 feet. That is over 3 miles straight down into total darkness. The ambient pressure at that depth exceeds 7,000 pounds per square inch. It is an alien environment, utterly hostile to all human machinery, where standard naval salvage equipment simply implodes. To investigate this acoustic anomaly, the United States Navy deployed a highly specialized, one-of-a-kind intelligence-gathering asset, the United States ship Halibut. The Halibut began its service life as a guided missile submarine, but it had been entirely gutted, retrofitted, and rebuilt for deep ocean espionage. Its massive forward missile hangar had been converted into a pressurized underwater laboratory. Packed with state-of-the-art mainframe computers, side-scan sonar processing equipment, and photographic development darkrooms, the Halibut was a covert deep-sea research vessel wrapped inside the stealthy hull of a nuclear-powered attack submarine. Under total secrecy, the Halibut slipped out of Pearl Harbor and sailed toward the triangulated coordinates. When the submarine arrived at the designated search grid, the crew initiated one of the most mechanically complex operations ever attempted by a submerged vessel. They opened a specialized trapdoor beneath the hull and deployed a custom-built 2-ton deep-tow camera sled simply referred to as the Fish. This heavy sled was equipped with high-intensity strobe lights, lateral side-scan sonar arrays, and heavy-duty pressure-housed cameras carrying thousands of feet of 70mm film. It was attached to the submarine by over 5 miles of specially fabricated, steel-armored coaxial cable. Think about the physics involved in this maneuver. The Halibut had to slowly tow this massive sled 3 miles below itself, maintaining a precise speed and depth while navigating blind over an unknown underwater mountain range. The winch operators had to constantly adjust the extreme cable tension to ensure the sled hovered just 30 feet above the ocean floor without crashing into jagged volcanic rocks. Because there was no live video feed, the crew was operating completely in the dark. The Halibut would tow the sled back and forth for hours, agonizingly reel the massive cable back in, retrieve the camera sled, develop the wet film in their onboard darkroom, and then project the images to see if they had actually flown over anything of interest. It was akin to flying a helicopter through a dense fog while dangling a camera on a string to photograph a coin in a dense forest. For weeks, the halibut methodically mowed the lawn, dragging the fish back and forth across the abyssal plain. The sonar pinged off thousands of false targets, volcanic outcroppings, geological ridges, trenches. But then, the side-scan sonar returned a sharp, angular acoustic shadow that did not look geologic. It looked engineered. The crew carefully maneuvered the sled directly over the anomaly and triggered the high-intensity strobes, firing the cameras into the pitch-black water. When the crew developed the long spools of film under the red lights of the dark room, the blurry images slowly materialized. They were not looking at rocks. They were looking at a vast, chaotic debris field. By making dozens of agonizingly slow, calculated passes over the site, the fish captured over 20,000 high-resolution photographs of the ocean floor. The intelligence analysts on board painstakingly stitched these images together into a massive, highly detailed mosaic. The pictures revealed a shattered landscape of torn metal resting in the freezing sediment. There was the distinct shape of a heavily damaged sail, a fractured pressure hull, and the unmistakable gaping holes of vertical launch tubes. They had found it. Resting in the deep was the holy grail of naval intelligence. Look at the sheer scale of the intelligence prize resting in those photographs. While the hull had suffered catastrophic structural failure and massive implosion damage, large sections of the submarine remained remarkably intact. The analysts peering at these photographs realized they were looking at an unprecedented opportunity. Inside the dark, flooded steel tube were specialized cryptographic machines, Soviet codebooks, naval communication protocols, and the mechanical blueprints of the enemy fleet. Most importantly, still seated in their armored silos, were the nuclear ballistic missiles themselves. Capturing this hardware would instantly advance the United States' understanding of Soviet strategic capabilities by an entire decade. It would allow weapons designers to analyze the precise metallurgical composition of enemy missiles, reverse engineer their guidance systems, and dissect the mathematical logic of their targeting computers. But finding the wreckage was merely the first phase of an impossible engineering problem. The submarine was resting under 3 miles of dense salt water. No human diver could ever reach it. Standard naval salvage vessels operated at a fraction of this depth, and lifting even a small 1,000-pound object from 16,400 feet was considered the absolute bleeding edge of oceanographic technology. But the intelligence prize was simply too massive to ignore. The United States government did not just want photographs of the wreckage. They wanted to pick it up. They wanted to drag the mangled, waterlogged remains of the submarine all the way to the surface and pull it apart piece by piece in a dry dock. With the exact layout of the wreckage mapped and the nuclear prizes identified, how could the Central Intelligence Agency engineer a way to secretly hoist a 2,000-ton chunk of mangled steel to the surface under the watchful eyes of the Soviet Navy? The United States Navy had accomplished the impossible by mapping the shattered wreckage, but their role effectively ended there. Taking high-resolution photographs of an anomaly in the deep ocean is a complex reconnaissance mission. Actually, reaching out and lifting that thousands of tons of heavy steel to the surface is an entirely different operational reality. Traditional naval salvage doctrines were completely useless here. Standard maritime recovery operations rely heavily on thick, braided steel cables and massive buoyancy pontoons. But at a crushing depth of 16,400 feet, standard steel lifting cables will simply snap under their own immense dead weight before they even reach the ocean floor. Add in the dynamic, unpredictable loading of deep ocean currents and the violent mechanical stress of surface swells, and traditional salvage methods become physically impossible. The military realized they needed an entirely new branch of mechanical engineering, and they handed the problem over to the Directorate of Science and Technology within the Central Intelligence Agency. This highly classified effort was designated Project Azorian. The engineers at the agency looked away from standard naval salvage and turned instead to the bleeding edge of the offshore oil drilling industry. Instead of relying on flexible, easily broken cables, they theorized they could use a massive, rigid string of heavy steel drill pipe. By connecting heavy pipe sections together, they could slowly lower a custom-built mechanical recovery vehicle inch by inch to the bottom of the ocean. But to manage a pipe string of that immense length and weight, they needed a specialized ship, unlike anything ever constructed in the history of naval architecture. They needed a colossal vessel capable of lifting a massive, waterlogged weight through an internal bay, all while remaining perfectly geostationary in the rough, churning seas of the Pacific. Here is where the operational paradox of this mission gets incredibly complex. You cannot secretly construct a ship the size of a heavy cruiser, pack it with experimental heavy lifting derricks, and sail it out into the middle of the North Pacific without attracting the attention of every Soviet spy satellite and intelligence trawler on the globe. The agency needed a cover story so brazen, so financially plausible, that it would completely mask a massive black-budget intelligence operation. They found their answer in the eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes. The Central Intelligence Agency secretly approached Hughes and his vast corporate empire, the Summa Corporation, to serve as the public face of the entire operation. The cover story they fabricated together was brilliant in its simplicity. Howard Hughes was allegedly pivoting his massive empire into a radical new commercial industry called deep ocean mining. The stated public goal of this venture was to dredge the abyssal plains of the Pacific Ocean for manganese nodules. These are small potato-sized chunks of rare minerals naturally scattered across the deep sea floor. It was a perfect, completely plausible commercial excuse to build a highly specialized deep water extraction vessel, heavily staff it with civilian contractors, and park it in the open ocean for months on end. Behind this meticulously crafted corporate illusion, the massive salvage vessel was born. Commissioned as the Hughes Glomar Explorer, it was constructed on the east coast by the Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. It was a colossal piece of heavy maritime engineering, measuring over 618 feet long and displacing tens of thousands of tons. Outwardly, to the casual observer or a distant spy plane, it looked exactly like an oversized commercial drill ship, dominated by a massive, towering steel derrick amidships. But the interior of the Glomar Explorer was a labyrinth of highly classified mechanical systems designed for one specific task. The absolute heart of the vessel was a massive internal docking bay known as the moon pool. This was a cavernous, flooded hangar positioned directly in the center of the ship's hull, sealed from the ocean below by massive sliding steel doors. The objective was to slowly hoist the ruined Soviet submarine straight up from the deep, open the bottom doors, pull the dripping wreckage entirely inside the ship, and then slide the doors shut. This would completely hide the salvaged hull from any Soviet ships or aircraft monitoring the ocean surface, allowing the intelligence analysts to tear the submarine apart in a completely enclosed, dry environment. But the physical environment of the North Pacific presented a massive mechanical hurdle to this plan. The ocean surface is constantly moving. A ship the size of the Glomar Explorer will continuously heave, pitch, and roll with the heavy ocean swells. If you attach 3 miles of rigid, heavy steel pipe to a ship that is rising and falling by 10 feet every few seconds, the sheer dynamic stress will rip the steel pipe apart in a matter of hours. To solve this critical physics problem, engineers designed a revolutionary heave compensation system. The entire heavy lifting mechanism, along with the massive central derrick, was mounted on heavy hydraulic gimbals. Using banks of massive compressed air cylinders and highly sensitive mechanical gyroscopes, this massive central carriage floated independently from the rest of the ship. While the outer hull of the Glomar Explorer pitched and violently rolled in the heavy ocean swells, the central lifting rig remained perfectly stationary relative to the seafloor beneath them, smoothly absorbing massive amounts of kinetic energy. Hanging from this immense, stabilized derrick was the actual capture vehicle. In the highly classified engineering briefings of the era, the designers simply referred to it as Clementine. It was a massive, skeletal steel claw, weighing over 2,000 tons on its own. It was equipped with heavy pressure housings containing closed-circuit television cameras, specialized sonar arrays, and high-intensity lighting. Most importantly, it featured massive, hydraulically actuated grapple arms designed to articulate and wrap entirely around the cylindrical steel pressure hull of the sunken submarine. The plan was to slowly lower Clementine down through the moon pool on the rigid string of heavy drill pipe. The heavy industry crew would have to manually thread and connect 60-foot sections of thick steel pipe one at a time. It was a grueling, physically demanding process that would take nearly an entire week of continuous labor just to reach the bottom. Fast forward to the summer of 1974. The Hughes Glomar Explorer sails into the North Pacific under the guise of its mining expedition and arrives precisely at the acoustic coordinates identified years earlier. The crew immediately initiates the agonizingly slow process of lowering the massive pipe string. Look at the sheer mechanical scale of what is happening here. They are attempting to thread a needle in pitch blackness under 3 miles of dense, freezing water. They must meticulously maneuver a heavy steel claw using small lateral water thrusters, all suspended on a heavy steel string stretching so incredibly far into the depths that the metal itself actually stretches, twisting and compressing like a rubber band under its own immense weight. But that extreme engineering challenge is only part of the story. While the crew wrestles with the complex physics of deep water salvage, they suddenly realize they are not alone on the open ocean. The Soviet military may have officially abandoned their search grid years ago, but their intelligence apparatus still actively monitors massive American engineering vessels loitering near their old strategic patrol zones. Shortly after the Glomar Explorer begins lowering the heavy pipe string, a Soviet naval intelligence gathering ship appears on the horizon. The Soviet vessel is the Chazma. Just a few days later, a second Soviet vessel, a sea-going heavy tug named Zorky, arrives on the scene and joins the watch. These Soviet ships do not simply sail past on their way to other ports. They stop. They maneuver incredibly close to the Glomar Explorer, deliberately crowding the massive American ship. Soviet naval intelligence officers stand out in the open on the weather decks, aiming heavy telephoto lenses across the water, constantly photographing every single piece of machinery visible on the American vessel. The tension on the bridge of the Glomar Explorer is absolute. The American crew, a highly unusual mix of roughneck civilian heavy industry contractors and covert intelligence operatives, must maintain strict, uncompromising radio discipline. They have to play the part of civilian manganese miners perfectly. They cannot deploy military defenses. They cannot radio for heavily armed destroyer escorts to chase the Soviet ships away. They must simply stand there on the steel decks and watch as the Soviet ships aggressively circle them. They must operate fully aware that the target they are secretly trying to hoist right up into the belly of their ship is an armed nuclear ballistic missile submarine belonging to the very men staring at them through binoculars. At one highly tense point during the operation, the Soviet tug even launches a small motorized lifeboat, slowly circling the Glomar Explorer to intimately examine the water churning around the heavy hull. Below the surface, completely hidden from the prying eyes of the Soviet intelligence officers, Clementine finally reaches the abyssal plain. The camera feeds in the heavily guarded control room flicker to life, illuminating the shattered, rusted remains of the heavy steel hull resting in the freezing sediment. Slowly, using tiny, calculated bursts from the lateral thrusters, the operators align the massive steel framework of the capture vehicle directly over the targeted hull section. The hydraulic commands are sent down miles of specialized multiplex cable. The heavy steel grabber arms slowly articulate outward and then downward, digging deep into the dense, ancient mud of the sea floor, wrapping their heavy mechanical joints around the thick steel of the submarine. The lift finally begins. The massive hydraulic rams on the heave compensation system scream under the immense physical load as they attempt to break the heavy suction of the deep ocean mud. The miles of steel pipe groan under the combined weight of the heavy capture vehicle and the completely waterlogged, deeply buried remnants of the submarine. As the Glomar Explorer continuously positions itself against the heavy swells of the Pacific, with Soviet intelligence gathering ships circling just yards away, a massive question hangs over the entire operation. Would Clementine's specially fabricated mechanical claws actually hold the immense, waterlogged weight of the heavy steel submarine as it was dragged upward through miles of unforgiving ocean? To pull the wreckage up, the heavy lift crew on the Glomar Explorer had to reverse the entire grueling process of lowering the capture vehicle. They could not simply reel in a cable. They had to haul the massive steel pipe string up one section at a time. Every 60 feet, the massive hydraulic elevators had to stop. The heavy steel collars had to lock onto the pipe. The roughnecks on the drilling floor had to engage massive rotary wrenches, break the threaded joint, unspin the 60-foot pipe section, lift it away, rack it in the hold, and then attach the elevators to the next joint to begin the pull again. Think about the mechanical stress this introduces. They are not executing a smooth, continuous lift. They are pulling, stopping, clamping, jarring, and pulling again. Every single time those massive hydraulic brakes engage, a colossal dynamic shockwave travels all the way down the 3-mile string of steel pipe. At the bottom of that pipe hangs Clementine, clutching a massive, completely waterlogged, structurally compromised section of a Soviet ballistic missile submarine. The total suspended weight hanging from the center of the ship is staggering. The engineering dials in the control room are reading millions of pounds of static tension. But static tension is only one part of the physics equation. The true danger lies in the dynamic load. Even with the revolutionary heave compensation system absorbing the massive vertical displacement of the Pacific swells, a fractional percentage of that kinetic energy still bleeds through the system. The heavy pipe string bounces microscopically. The capture vehicle shudders. Inside the flooded steel cylinder of the submarine, thousands of tons of wet sediment and trapped seawater slosh back and forth. The hull of a Gulf II class submarine is constructed from a specialized Soviet naval alloy known as AK-25 steel. It is a dense, high-yield material forged to withstand the immense atmospheric crushing force of deep ocean patrols. It is incredibly strong, but it is heavy. Furthermore, after resting in the corrosive, highly pressurized environment of the seafloor for 6 years, the metallurgical integrity of the hull is completely unpredictable. It is riddled with microscopic stress fractures from the initial sinking and the catastrophic implosion that tore the vessel apart in 1968. Stay with me here, because this is where the raw limits of material science collide with the ambition of naval intelligence. Clementine's massive mechanical grabber arms were engineered from specialized high-strength steel. They were designed to encapsulate the curved hull of the submarine, providing equalized pressure along the length of the targeted section. But as the Glomar Explorer slowly hauls the wreckage upward, crossing the freezing thermal layers of the deep Pacific, an invisible battle of physics is taking place. The waterlogged weight of the submarine is constantly fighting the grip of the mechanical tines. For days, the agonizing ascent continues. The heavy lift crew works in exhausting, continuous shifts. The targeted section of the submarine slowly rises from 16,400 feet. It passes the 14,000-foot mark, then 12,000 feet. The crew in the control room watches the grainy, low-light television monitors heavily guarded within the ship. They can see the mangled steel of the Soviet vessel suspended in the dark water beneath them. They are halfway home. Then, somewhere around the 9,000-foot depth mark, the physical threshold of the machinery is finally breached. It does not happen with a massive, cinematic explosion. It begins with a single, highly localized structural failure. One of the massive steel tines on the capture vehicle fractures under the immense shear stress. When one arm snaps, the carefully engineered weight distribution of the entire lifting rig is instantly destroyed. The load violently shifts to the remaining tines. The heavy Soviet AK-25 steel hull twists within the grip of the mechanical claws. The shifting weight applies a massive asymmetric torsional load that Clementine was simply never designed to hold. The control room watches the closed-circuit monitors in stunned silence as the nightmare unfolds in slow motion. The massive grabber arms begin to crack and bend outward. The structural integrity of the submarine hull, already heavily damaged by the implosion years earlier, finally gives way under the extreme mechanical strain. The massive chunk of the targeted submarine breaks apart. Look at what the declassified engineering postmortems reveal about this specific moment. 2/3 of the targeted hull section simply tears away from the forward bow piece. This lost section contains the absolute most critical objectives of Project Azorian. It contains the elongated sail structure. It contains the heavily armored vertical launch tubes still holding the SSN-4 nuclear ballistic missiles. And it contains the primary cryptological room, housing the Soviet code machines and the highly classified communication logs. Freed from the grip of the capture vehicle, this colossal mass of jagged steel and nuclear weaponry plummets back into the abyss. It falls for nearly 2 miles, tearing through the deep sound channel, hydrodynamically spinning and accelerating until it violently impacts the ocean floor, shattering into an unrecoverable debris field. The sudden loss of millions of pounds of dead weight sends a massive shockwave snapping upward through the miles of steel pipe. The Glomar Explorer shudders violently on the surface. Alarms sound across the heavy lift deck. The crew must immediately stabilize the wildly oscillating pipe string before the kinetic rebound tears the central derrick right off its hydraulic gimbals. When the extreme mechanical chaos finally subsides, the intelligence operatives look at the surviving camera feeds. The mission is heavily compromised. The nuclear missiles are gone. The primary code room is gone. But the claw is not entirely empty. Clutched in the surviving forward grabber arms of Clementine is a jagged, roughly 40-foot section of the submarine's forward bow. The order is given to continue the lift. There is no other option. They cannot drop the remaining piece, and they certainly cannot lower the pipe to try again. The heavy lift crew goes back to work, meticulously breaking down the pipe string, raising the surviving chunk of wreckage foot by agonizing foot. Finally, the massive mechanical vehicle reaches the surface and is pulled entirely up into the cavernous moon pool of the Glomar Explorer. The massive underwater steel doors slowly slide shut, locking the ocean out and sealing the wreckage inside the ship. Pumps rapidly drain the seawater from the central bay. As the water level drops, the intelligence analysts and heavy salvage engineers finally step out onto the catwalks and look down at their prize. Resting on the heavy steel grating is a deeply rusted, heavily crushed, toxic piece of a Soviet submarine. It is heavily contaminated with highly radioactive tritium gas, highly volatile missile propellant residue, and the dense, freezing mud of the ocean floor. It is only a fraction of what they set out to capture. But, as the intelligence officers prepare to don heavy protective suits and physically enter the shattered hull, an entirely different kind of disaster is brewing back on the mainland. The Central Intelligence Agency had heavily relied on the immense corporate umbrella of Howard Hughes to completely conceal this operation. But large, complex conspiracies involving massive corporate logistics are inherently vulnerable to human error and basic criminal coincidence. Months earlier, a seemingly random burglary had occurred at a Samoa Corporation office in Los Angeles. Thieves broke into a vault, stealing highly sensitive corporate documents. Amidst the stolen paperwork were internal memos, vaguely outlining a highly classified, heavily funded government maritime contract linked to the Hughes deep ocean mining cover story. These documents quietly filter through the underground network and eventually land on the desk of Jack Anderson. Jack Anderson is not just any reporter. He is a fiercely independent, highly aggressive investigative journalist with a massive national audience and a reputation for exposing heavy government secrets. He looks at the documents, connects the massive corporate expenditures, the unusual design of the Glomar Explorer, and the heavy presence of intelligence personnel. He figures out the core truth. The United States government is not mining for manganese nodules. They are secretly raising a Soviet submarine. As the crew of the Glomar Explorer is literally draining the water out of their moon pool in the middle of the Pacific, Jack Anderson is preparing to go public. The Central Intelligence Agency enters a state of absolute institutional panic. The director of Central Intelligence urgently contacts Anderson, pleading with him to kill the story, citing massive national security implications and the direct threat to the American personnel still floating in the open ocean, surrounded by Soviet naval assets. The agency attempts to construct a legal and public relations firewall, a maneuver that eventually spawns the famous Glomar response, where the government refuses to confirm or deny the existence of an operation. But the clock has simply run out. The press leak is inevitable. The cover story is unraveling. The Soviet Union is about to realize exactly how they were utterly humiliated in their own strategic backyard. With the operation compromised, the primary targets lost to the deep, and the public spotlight about to violently swing toward the Glomar Explorer, the intelligence analysts inside the sealed moon pool have only days to dissect the mangled steel sitting in front of them. What highly classified intelligence did the Central Intelligence Agency actually manage to salvage in the remaining hull section before the entire world found out? Inside the cavernous, artificially lit moon pool of the Hughes Glomar Explorer, the atmosphere is incredibly tense. The massive steel doors beneath the catwalks are heavily sealed against the immense pressure of the Pacific Ocean. The heavy salvage team and the covert intelligence operatives don thick, pressurized protective suits and heavy breathing apparatuses. They are stepping into a highly hazardous, utterly alien environment. The 40-foot chunk of mangled steel resting on the heavy drainage grating is caked in dense, ancient marine clay. It is dripping with highly corrosive hydraulic fluids and emitting dangerous levels of radioactive tritium gas. This is the shattered forward section of the Soviet submarine. Armed with heavy industrial cutting torches and specialized radiation monitoring equipment, the analysts begin meticulously slicing their way through the heavily crushed internal bulkheads. While the nuclear ballistic missiles and the primary cryptographic vault plunged back to the sea floor during the catastrophic failure of the mechanical capture vehicle, the recovered bow section is far from empty. Hidden inside the crushed forward torpedo tubes are two fully intact, nuclear-tipped anti-ship torpedoes. This is a massive, completely unprecedented intelligence coup. American weapons engineers finally have their hands on Soviet nuclear physics packages. They meticulously dismantle the warheads, analyzing the heavy fissile material, the intricate firing mechanisms, and the specific explosive yields. They study the heavy metallurgical composition of the torpedo casings and the exact chemical makeup of their propulsion systems. Furthermore, while the main code room is lost to the deep, the forward compartments yield secondary communication manuals, operational logs, and specialized acoustic processing equipment. By reverse engineering these heavy sonar sensors, the United States Navy gains a massive tactical advantage, understanding exactly how Soviet submarines listen to the ocean and how they isolate acoustic targets. But as the operatives carefully clear the freezing, dense mud from the ruined crew compartments, they find something that instantly grounds the entire massive geopolitical operation in solemn human reality. Entombed within the twisted, rusted steel are the remains of 6 Soviet submariners. These men had been sealed in absolute darkness for 6 years. The intelligence operatives, many of them seasoned military veterans themselves, immediately halt the frantic intelligence extraction. The Cold War animosity, the intense secrecy, and the immense engineering pressure are briefly set aside. Following strict, uncompromising naval tradition, the remains are carefully recovered from the wreckage and placed in heavily weighted flag-draped steel caskets. Inside the massive, echoing steel chamber of the moon pool, a formal military funeral is conducted in 2 languages. A chaplain reads the traditional prayers for the dead. The heavy steel doors beneath them are open just enough to expose the churning, gray water of the Pacific, and the 6 Soviet sailors are committed back to the deep. The entire solemn ceremony is recorded on high-speed color film. Decades later, during a rare moment of post-Cold War diplomacy, the director of Central Intelligence would travel to Moscow and personally hand this highly classified reel of film to the Russian leadership, providing a final, undeniable closure to families who had spent decades wondering what happened to their fathers and sons. Once the recovered hull section is completely stripped of its military hardware and the intelligence assets are securely vaulted, forensic engineers turn their full attention to solving the central mechanical mystery. Why did this heavily armed vessel silently disappear in the first place? By meticulously analyzing the inward blast patterns on the outer hull, the fractured structural ribs, and the metallurgical shear points of the recovered bow, a prevailing mechanical theory begins to emerge. The forensic evidence heavily points toward a catastrophic hydrogen gas explosion. Think about the immense banks of lead-acid batteries required to power a massive diesel-electric vessel underwater. When these heavy electrical cells are rapidly charged or deeply discharged, they continuously outgaze highly volatile, highly flammable hydrogen. Submarines are equipped with complex, heavy ventilation systems designed specifically to scrub this explosive gas from the ambient air. But a simple mechanical failure in a single ventilation fan, combined with an errant electrical spark from a high-voltage relay, can instantly turn a sealed battery compartment into a massive thermobaric bomb. The forensic timeline constructed by the engineers suggests a violent internal detonation crippled the boat, immediately blowing out a section of the pressure hull. This caused the submarine to flood catastrophically and plunge rapidly past its maximum crush depth, leading directly to the massive dual implosions recorded by the hydrophone networks. Here is where the historical consensus severely fractures. Some naval historians and highly ranked intelligence analysts look at the heavily classified navigational data and refuse to accept the simple battery explosion theory. They point out a glaring, highly suspicious operational anomaly. When the submarine sank, it was completely outside of its designated strategic patrol grid. It was sailing significantly closer to the Hawaiian Islands than any standard Soviet naval doctrine dictated. This extreme geographic discrepancy fuels a much darker, highly controversial assessment known as the rogue launch theory. According to this narrative, the captain, or a deeply indoctrinated faction of officers within the crew, had gone completely rogue. Operating outside the strict command structure of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, they allegedly attempted to initiate an unauthorized, preemptive nuclear strike against the massive United States naval installations at Pearl Harbor. Proponents of this theory argue that a highly classified fail-safe mechanism, built directly into the missile guidance systems by Soviet engineers, deliberately detonated the volatile liquid propellant inside the vertical launch tube to prevent the unauthorized launch. This fail-safe detonation would have blown the heavy steel sail apart, instantly destroying the vessel. While the Central Intelligence Agency has never publicly confirmed this terrifying theory, the undeniable fact that the submarine was inexplicably hundreds of miles away from its assigned station keeps this debate intensely alive in strategic circles. The Russian Naval Admiralty, however, holds a completely different, deeply entrenched view of the disaster. For decades, former fleet commanders have vehemently rejected both the battery explosion and the rogue launch theories. They argue that their submarine fell victim to an incredibly aggressive, highly dangerous tactic of the Cold War known as trailing. American fast attack submarines routinely shadowed Soviet vessels in the open ocean, attempting to navigate precisely in their acoustic blind spots directly behind their propellers to continuously record their mechanical signatures. The Russian assessment claims that an American nuclear attack submarine operating in the North Pacific during that exact time frame collided directly with the Soviet vessel, tearing its hull open. They point to the historical fact that just days after the disappearance, an American submarine sailed into a naval shipyard in Japan with a badly damaged sail, requiring immediate, highly classified emergency repairs. Look at what the declassified American acoustic data actually reveals to counter this specific claim. The hydrophone tapes from the middle of March recorded two distinct massive implosion events occurring extremely close together. If a massive underwater collision had occurred, the deep sound channel would have easily captured the distinct, grinding, high-frequency mechanical screech of two heavy steel hulls tearing into each other long before the actual implosion. The acoustic trace holds absolutely no evidence of a collision. Furthermore, the sheer physics of underwater naval warfare make the Russian theory highly improbable. If an American submarine had rammed a heavy Soviet ballistic hull hard enough to immediately sink it, the American boat would have almost certainly suffered massive, catastrophic structural failure and imploded alongside it, rather than limping thousands of miles across the ocean back to a safe port. The ultimate truth of what triggered the cascade of fatal events in the freezing waters northwest of Oahu may forever remain trapped in the crushed remains of the central command room, a twisted piece of steel that the massive mechanical claws failed to retrieve and which now rests permanently in the lightless abyss. The heavy lift operation itself, however, stands as one of the most audacious, mechanically staggering achievements in the history of deep ocean engineering. The intelligence apparatus successfully built a colossal, completely stabilized floating dry dock, masked it behind a fabricated billionaire mining empire, and reached 3 miles into the crushing darkness to pull thousands of tons of enemy steel from the ocean floor while Soviet intelligence ships watched completely unaware. Whether the lost submarine was a victim of a tragic mechanical flaw, an incredibly aggressive geopolitical gamble by a rogue commander, or a deadly game of underwater cat and mouse, it remains a permanent ghost of the Cold War. It is a sobering reminder of an era when the vast oceans were a silent, heavily armed battleground, where thousands of men lived and died in the crushing pressure of the deep, holding the absolute destructive power of the nuclear age entirely in their hands.